bowling ball going back and forth in a line from you to me.
Marcus, when you mentioned, can I just interrupt for a sec?
Yeah.
I just want to clarify something. And this is just for the proponents of the Apollo missions here. You mentioned there's no steering wheel in the command module, and you're just emphasizing a point there for people that want to use that to say that Marcus doesn't know what he's talking about. Of course, there's no steering wheel. You're actually emphasizing a point, is that you can't just steer around these radiation zones, willy-nilly. You've got to plan this. You've got to fire retro rockets. You've got to use a lot of propellant in order to maneuver the spacecraft. And another point that you piqued my interest here too with Amy Title. Now, for those of you who don't know, Amy Title is a pro NASA, pro Apollo. I won't call her a shill, but she's definitely on the payroll. I mean, she's definitely in there. She's actually been in. She's participated in some live podcasts from NASA Houston Control.
Yeah.
But recently she's fallen out of favor with them, and I just wanted to get your thoughts on this before we move on. And apparently she has, I think her publisher has dropped her as a client as well. I was watching a recent video of her. I sent it to you too, Marcus. I know you've seen it.
Yeah.
Very interesting. And she's also being accused of, and I don't know if this is being substantiated, so I'm not making that accusation myself. I'm just saying that she's also being accused of plagiarism in some parts of her book.
Yeah.
So, she seems like a nice person. I'm not, out to criticize her, but it just seems that there's a lot of infighting going in within the pro Apollo community itself. And that's the point that I'm trying to make. If you could just briefly elaborate on that before we move on.
Yeah. Amy Title, she's an attractive girl, nice girl.
Yeah.
She's very pro NASA. She tries to explain some of the more technical concepts behind Apollo and other space activities, whether it's the Artemis program or whether it's anything else. Her website, should you choose to look at it, or her YouTube channel, is called Vintage Space. So obviously she concentrates more on the Apollo side of things than the more modern side of things. And Curious Droid, Paul Shillito, is similarly, he's very, very knowledgeable about space travel, human space travel. He explains it very well, makes good videos. So it's worth looking at. But it's just, I picked up on this particular point that he's used Robert Broenig's calculations and illustrations to demonstrate how Apollo avoided the radiation belts. So by implication, they all acknowledge radiation is a danger to humans. And they try to come up with solutions to how Apollo happened if radiation is so dangerous. We've also got Phil Plait, who runs the Bad Astronomy website. What's his name? Windley, who does the clavius.org website.
Oh, what's your, is that?
Right. Jay Windley, that's right. Jay Windley.
Windley.
Clavius.org. They all follow this idea. And also Professor Ahu Uja, who's the UK head of the UK space facility near Leicester. They all say the same thing, because they're desperately trying to explain something that, shall we say, you and I and other people like us have pointed out relentlessly, because it's an important subject: the radiation dangers in space. They, by implication, acknowledge that space has radiation. I don't think that's in dispute. But they also try to explain how Apollo avoided the radiation in space by basing their answers on that produced by Robert Broenig, which sounds quite logical until you start to dissect it and to work out exactly what was going on. And as you said, Robert Browning has removed his paper from the internet. It's available through our own website with the references. The 246 references that are contained in our book are on a website, which you can go to and look at it, and you can see the original paper. We've put it up there, along with many other very interesting stories, because it's 55 years now in 2024 since Apollo 11 landed, just over 55 years. That's 2 generations. So a lot of people, yourself, many other authors, Trevor Weaver, myself, Scott Henderson, Robert Williams, you mentioned Jarrah White, David Percy, and Mary Bennett, who wrote Dark Moon. We've all started looking into this, and it's really only in the last maybe 30 years, maybe a bit less, that the information is widely available, that we can now examine it. The Soviet Union, now the Russian Federation, are also as interested, from their own point of view, to look at the same information, which they do. They have access to the same information we all do now. And it's becoming very clear, I could say blindingly obvious, that the explanations for how humans avoided radiation in space don't stack up. They don't make any sense. Because one of the problems of radiation is it's cumulative in the human body. If you're exposed to radiation, like, sunlight, that's radiation, visible light. You stay out too long in the sun, you get sunburnt. That's the one effect of radiation. But the higher frequencies, the X-rays, the gamma rays, they're much higher frequency, and they penetrate into the body and accumulate there. Over time, they will dissipate, but they will have an effect. So by implication, a lot of these pro-NASA supporters are desperately trying to come up with a plausible sounding excuse. The trouble is, it's not plausible, it's not an excuse, and NASA still have yet to explain how they protected their own astronauts. And now they're sending them on the Artemis program. Quite soon, we're told. I suspect there's going to be a long delay before any humans are allowed to go.
There's no protection against gamma rays. I mean, I don't care what the gamma rays was. Isn't that photon radiation? It travels at the speed of light, if I'm not mistaken. There's no protection against that. We don't have in our arsenal of protective gear right now at this level that we know of, in terms of the equipment that we have and the methods that can protect from gamma radiation. So that's just one example right there. I want to back up just a couple of, you mentioned Curious Droid and Amy Title. I like to be fair to them. To be fair to them, those are 2 individuals that probably believe in what they're saying. They've never attacked us. They get a lot more views than us because the algorithm favors their version of events than our version of events. So he'll get 40, 50,000, I'll get 300 views, but we all know what's behind that. And it's interesting that I get comparable views on BitChute and Rumble, which would translate into tens of thousands of views on YouTube. But that's another story for another day. That's all about censorship.
Good point.
But the one individual that does like to attack us, and that's Windley from clavius.org. He does attack a lot of people. He gets very personal about it, and that really, for me, takes away from his own argument, because he actually discredits himself. And it's very difficult to take anyone seriously. It's different when we're talking about him, because I'm kind of countering his claims, but I'm not going out of my way to go after him, right? And that's the difference between their community and our community. We don't go out. I've never posted a comment on Curious Droid's videos or Amy Title's videos. We don't agree. So why am I going to, if I'm posting a comment on there, I'm looking for a fight, right? So I don't go looking for a fight. We don't bring it to them. But they seem to want to bring it to us, even though I admit that Amy Title the likes of Amy Title, she's kind, right? And you're right, she seems like a nice person, right? But that's the difference between our community. And I was just thinking about that when you were talking, that's kind of a fundamental difference. There are a couple that are trying to meet halfway now. I did one debate with, and some people call it a discussion, I guess you can call it that, with Justin Cox. And he's now reached out and asked to do another one. So I don't mind that. He's trying to meet us halfway. My guard is always up, with any of them, including Justin, but he's being fair. So we'll see where it's going to go. He's, if he wants another debate and or discussion, I'll give it to him. I'll have that. We'll gladly have that. But I do like that when people come forward and they generally want to talk. That's what I want to do. If anybody wants to talk to any of us, we do a live podcast in Apollo Detectives. Yeah. And we take questions all the time. So people can come on there and ask us anything they want, and it works really well. So, the floor is theirs, and you're welcome to come on and ask us any questions, or you can contact me and I'll be happy to have a discussion with you. I don't like the word debate because that's sort of antagonistic, right? Yeah. Let's have a discussion. I have a moderator. The moderator is very fair. He's not sure if he's for or against the Apollo mission, so that makes him perfect.
Yeah,
because he's very objective. But anyway, I digress. Let's move on to our next chapter here. And I have we're going to go on now to, and Marcus, that was a very good description of what's going on in terms of the radiation in space and the challenges that manned missions really have. And some of those challenges actually apply to unmanned missions because it can affect the equipment on board. So they have to take many precautions, as you mentioned earlier, when it comes to, before when it came to film. Now it's digital, but definitely there's still challenges for unmanned missions as well.
In fact, just before we
sure.
leave the radiation, I was just going to bring it up to date because there's been a remarkable film produced by, I think it's an official film, because obviously this radiation question is still it's not been answered, let's put it that way. So the latest Artemis mission has been told that if there is a radiation problem, let's say a solar flare, solar particle event, which is monitored from Earth quite regularly. So we do know if there's going to be a major solar flare, which produces the solar particle events, which produce the radiation problems. They're told that they must get into a part of the spacecraft furthest from the sun, presumably they're pointing their heat shield at it, and that they must surround themselves with water bottles, because water is a protection. So they must make a sort of little den in, like kids would build little dens with bits of furniture. They built a little den inside their spacecraft and put the water bottles all around them. That's the explanation we've got to so far. Now,
I've never heard that. Yeah, that's incredible.
You can see them. They sort of put the water bottles over their head. They get down inside it. I mean, when I say water bottles, they're sort of rectangular shaped containers of water, which is a good protection against radiation.
Yeah, of course. Yes.
There's also another much more recent development. It's called a carbon nitrate nanotube. That's only been developed in the last 3 or 4 years. Carbon nitrate nanotube, which can protect against radiation. And it's a particular formula. I don't know the full details of it, but that can protect against radiation. There weren't such things back in Apollo days as carbon nitrate nanotubes, water bottles, or even a fear of radiation for the astronauts, which explains why they never went, because otherwise they'd all be dead by now. So there is a lot of research going on about protecting against radiation. I mean, these are all being the carbon nitrate nanotubes, which is a sort of lattice work material, which you can build up and make into sheets and surround equipment and humans with it. That's very recent. Now, just one final point. I attended a presentation given by one of the major scientists at the Harwell Atomic Energy Research Institute here in the UK, who was at the British Interplanetary Society to talk about radiation. I thought, oh, I want to listen to this. And she explained about radiation quite well. It was obviously she knew her subject. And I stuck my hand up as usual, idiot that I am, and said, how are the Apollo astronauts protected against radiation, Professor? You know what her answer was? Well, it was the luck of Apollo. That was the best she could come up with, the luck of Apollo. And this talk, this talk was given about 6, 7 years ago. Very lucky was Apollo. It managed to avoid all these nasties coming at them from deep space, galactic cosmic rays, from the sun, solar particle events. So they had to build their little den inside their spacecraft. But that's Artemis, that's not Apollo. I hadn't thought of it for Apollo. And so, but it's the luck of Apollo. And Apollo was certainly a very lucky mission. All 6 of them.
Incredible. You reminded me of, I forget her name. It's in my book anyway. She worked for the NOAA, National Oceanic Agency, something like that. It was a lot to do with weather. So she's a scientist, and and that's why I put her quote in the book, because she had mentioned the Apollo missions, and she basically said exactly what this professor you just talked about now said, is that it was a miracle that nothing happened on the way there and back. And I interpret that, her quote and the quote you just gave, as code for don't talk to me about it, because I can't give an opinion. But basically what they're saying is that it was impossible for them to have done what they claim. So
Yeah.
that's how I read it, right?
Yeah.
And there was one other point I was going to, what was that? I think I wrote it down here. Yeah, I think there was one other point. Yeah, the Russians. Okay, so when you were talking about, just want to wrap this up here with this point. You mentioned earlier we were talking about the Russians, and I find that a very interesting subject too, because the argument from the the proponents of the Apollo missions, as you would agree, are always saying, well, if the Russians knew it was a hoax, they would have said so. Well, they're saying it now, and it doesn't seem to be good enough, because the scientists are saying it, but not the politicians. So I guess they're waiting for the politicians, the Russian politicians, to say, well, I'm going to give you all a hint. Russian politicians are just like our politicians, okay? You're not going to get truth from a politician, all right? Yeah. So if that's where you're at, all the best to you, all right? But you have Russian scientists that are coming out now and blatantly saying that these missions didn't happen. We know they didn't happen. So just wanted to put that footnote in. Marcus, let's move on to chapter 6.
Okay.
We spent a lot of time on chapter 5. That's a fascinating subject, you know? You can't help but spend so much time on that, because there's so much involved when it comes to radiation. I mean, it's just not a topic and to be skimmed over. We spend an hour on this, and there's been thousands of pages written on it. But when you read a book by a proponent talking about how safe it is to go through the Van Allen belts, you get a page and a half. Yeah. And yet we've just spent an hour talking about it.
Yeah.
Right. So there's so much to talk about, and we'll continue to talk about this subject. So let's move on now to chapter 6. And chapter 6 is, I took 2 small points from that, because it really is, there's a lot of detail in your chapter, too much to go through here on the video, but a couple of points that I did want to mention, because this chapter for folks out there, is chapter 6 is called Transmission Delays. And that's another factor that reveals that the Apollo missions didn't happen. It was kind of a screw up on NASA's part to factor in that delay in communication from the moon and back. So what I'll do is I'm going to read the very first paragraph on page 49 and just have you chat a little bit about that. So let's read that paragraph first.
Okay.
For the viewer. So communication between Houston Mission Control and the astronauts supposedly on the moon was by radio waves which traveled at the speed of light, a staggering 186,282 miles per second. That's about 300,000 kilometers per second. The moon is about 240,000 miles distant from the Earth. So radio waves from the moon would take about 1.3 seconds to reach us here on Earth. That means that the signal of an astronaut communicating from the moon would take 1.3 seconds to reach mission control on Earth. Likewise, any signal from mission control would take 1.3 seconds to reach the astronauts on the moon. So we always have a delay in the communications between mission control and the Apollo astronauts. Now, I want to turn to your quote here on page 50, because that's a good follow-up to what we just read here. So on page 50, the second paragraph down, you say this: there are many examples in the Apollo record of this transmission delay being too short that can only be explained if the astronauts are not on the moon. Here, Xavier Pascal shows several solid examples in which the transmission delay is incorrect, and as a consequence, the astronauts cannot have been on the moon.
Right, pretty definite, isn't it?
Yep.
It's physics, by the way. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is basic physics. The speed of light is acknowledged, has been experimented with, 186,000 miles per second. That's the speed of light. It's also the speed of radio waves when transmitted. There's no dispute about that. So it takes 1.3 seconds to reach the moon with a radio wave, and 1.3 seconds to come back from the moon with a radio wave, which is how communication was conducted. So 2.6, maybe 3 seconds to give a bit of time for thought as well, between a question being asked from Houston, Mission Control, and a reply received back at Houston from allegedly the moon. Minimum of 2.6 seconds, probably a bit longer. But they don't appear on the original recordings. They're much less. There is a delay on many of the recordings, but the delay is about 1 second. And there are several occasions when it's much less than that, when you add in the fact that these were being recorded at Houston, these conversations. So if a question was being asked and an answer was being given, you would expect a delay of at least 2.6 seconds, if not longer, between the question being asked and the reply being received. That's physics, and it's also basic science. So if that delay is not present on the official unedited recordings, which we're told exist, what's going on? Did they screw up? Did they not make enough time delay and just screwed up and forgot about it? Because those original recordings have now mysteriously vanished from the internet, from the NASA record. They have the correct time now, but the original recordings, which we've listened to, don't have that correct delay between question and answer. So what's going on? Did NASA just screw up and get it wrong and said, whoops, get all the recordings back? Unfortunately, they didn't get them all back because some still exist with the short delay in the recording. But they shouldn't, those short delays shouldn't be there.
Now that recording, those recordings, Marcus, you're talking about, they were actually played, they were live. These are live on-air recordings for the world to hear.
Yeah.
So the argument has been from people from proponents, the argument has been, and it's just not an argument for me that holds up, is that they edited out the delay in order to make it easier for us, for us mere mortals here, the dumb people, to understand. Now, first of all, the editing out the delay live is probably impossible back then with that technology.
Yeah.
And second of all, why would NASA, if they were doing that, then why didn't NASA put some kind of disclaimer or some kind of statement to that effect, that we are editing out the delay so to make it easier for the audience to hear the communication back and forth? And then, of course, and as you just mentioned, they pull those recordings, and now we've got the recordings with the delay in there.
Yeah.
So that's basically admitting their mistake.
It is. It's admitting the mistake. It's desperately trying to correct the mistake by putting in the correct delay. It's quite easy to do on tape, which is how they all recorded, probably reel-to-reel tapes. Probably quite high quality equipment as well, because they wanted to record this conversation. And the conversation has been transcribed, and it's all in the Apollo Lunar Service Journal. But that's a written document, so it won't have the delay shown in it. It doesn't need to be. But it's a good point you make about, if NASA did edit them, they didn't put a disclaimer, as you suggest they should have done, to say that the communication delays have been edited out to make it easier to listen to. They didn't say that. That is fake news if they didn't do that. That is fabrication, because those recordings are now fiction, because they're not correct. But they were pronounced to be the original recordings. Well, they may have been original recordings, but they weren't made from the moon. They were made with what they thought would be a suitable delay, and they got it wrong. They screwed up. They made a mistake, and they dare not admit it. If they'd just come out and said, sorry guys, we got it a bit wrong. We tried to edit the tapes down, but we didn't get it right, and there should have been delays, and this is why. You could explain why, as we just done, speed of light and all that. If they'd been honest, this is the point. NASA have not been honest with the people who paid not only their salaries, but also all the contractors who were working under their control. The American taxpayer paid for it, in effect. The $25 billion that Apollo was supposedly costed at the time of the missions 55 years ago. That would be equivalent to about $217 billion today. So, yes, it was an expensive operation, but at least be honest about what's going on, and then we might believe you when you tell us things. At the moment, we have very little hope that you are being honest enough to explain these things correctly, which is why you're having such terrible problems getting Artemis off the ground.
Yeah.
That was ordered by President Trump 2019, 5 years ago.
Yeah.
Still hasn't got off the ground. Well, no, it has got off the ground, but not with astronauts on board, because you don't dare put them on board, because they have probably asked you, what protection are you going to offer us against radiation? And NASA don't have an answer to them. It's sad. It's very sad that it's come to this, that we can mock NASA for their incompetence, their inaccuracy, and their dishonesty.
Your love's just like a wrecking ball going back and forth in a line from